the ultimate root of morality is a good and holy God who created the cosmos and set up the purposes and goals of living organisms.
Welcome to another episode of the KKD Show podcast. I am with Dr. Paul Nedelisky. Paul Nedelisky is the Assistant Director and Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. He is co-author with Dr. James Davison Hunter of Science and Good, the book we're going to talk today, The Tragic Quest for the Foundations of Morality. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Virginia. Dr. Paul Nedelisky, welcome to the podcast.
Kieran, thanks so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
Right. Yeah. So I'm really interested to talk to you about this book. I read your book and it was fascinating. And the reason that I thought I ought to ask you about this is because, like we mentioned just a while ago, there is a trend in my own land where people seem to be driven towards a sort of Western conception of morality, while at the same time having the old ideas together. It's sort of a mix. So maybe I'd like to start asking you about whether morality is objective or subjective. How do you view this dichotomy, if it is one? And because that seems to be the place where most people start, about whether morality itself is objective or subjective.
Yeah, well, I think it's objective, at least at its root. I mean, there's a way in which it can seem subjective, which I'll explain. But I think for me, the foundation of why I think morality is objective is based in my specific ethical beliefs. You know, I think human beings are extremely valuable. I mean, ultimately, I think that God created the world. God is good. God created a purpose for the things that he made, and that purpose explains a great deal about what things are and why they are the way they are. And so along with that comes purpose that organisms are supposed to fulfill. And furthermore, God gave human beings reason and rationality. You know, we can think about what we do. We have some measure of free will, and so we can choose to follow God's way, the way that the order that God put into the universe, or we can choose not to. And that, and so that I think is the root of why I think it's objective. But even from a non, even from not from the perspective of a particular religion, I think there's something accessible, something visible, discernible about the value of human beings that everyone is able to recognize. They may deny that they see it, but I think that they do. It can be easier or harder based on who you spend time with and your surrounding culture. But I think that the objectivity of morality is discernible even apart from Christianity or a particular religious stance. I mean, I think one way to see this, I think, is not always, but most of the time, like in movies that everybody watches, the morality that's presupposed is objective. You know, something bad is happening to a character, or there's a danger or a threat, and the narrative
and we're
presupposes.
supposed to feel,
yeah, you're supposed to feel about a certain way. It's not like, oh, well, that's just what they think. I mean, if there are some things in the world that are subjective. You know, if they made a movie where somebody's favorite ice cream is strawberry, and the ice cream store wasn't going to have any more strawberry ice cream, you couldn't care too much. You know, you might get up and walk out of the theater. So I think, there are little signs and indicators that really everybody resonates with objective morality, even if they've talked themselves into saying they don't believe it. And well, I think, Christianity explains that well, but you don't have to be a Christian to see that. So that's why I think it's objective. I mean, just briefly, there are things about it that can seem subjective based on cultural expectations for how different duties or responsibilities or good things are to be acted towards. So Well, where I live in Virginia, at least before COVID-19, when you first meet somebody, you're expected to shake their hand. And if someone put their hand out and you didn't shake it, that would be offensive. And it's often wrong to treat people without respect and to offend them. So that would be the objective component. But the fact that that is expressing itself through a handshake, that varies with the culture. There are plenty of cultures where you don't shake hands. And so that seems subjective, but it's still trying to get at this objective root, which is respect for other persons. So I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah, tell
No,
me what you
yeah,
think.
yeah, no, yeah, that is, and there is objectivity to morality. The reason I ask that is because you see a lot of people, right, at least in the present culture, they seem to want morality to be subjective, because if it is subjective, or if you can at least argue that it is subjective, then you don't necessarily have to deal with a transcendent reality, so to speak. You can use the apparent subjectivity of morality to kind of go with the flow, I guess. And that's why I asked that question in the first place. And Paul Nedelisky's book is, in fact, the starting of the book is the tragic quest for the foundations of morality. So I guess why tragic?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think we say tragic because in the book we're looking at this search for how to know what is right and wrong and on what basis to order society. We're looking at it as a story that unfolds starting from the beginning of what we might call the modern era in the West, the scientific revolution, I guess you could say.
The 1500s and the 1600s, would that be the era?
Sure. Yeah. Like with most historical
Renaissance.
periods, yeah, you kind of just at the end of the Renaissance. I mean, I think some of the key starting points for the period we're talking about are the decline of Catholic Aristotelian theology as sort of the basic understanding of the world, and also because of the Protestant Reformation and the way local nations responded to that, it caused a kind of a huge splintering. Countries broke apart, and new forms of worship appeared, and the result of that was the opportunity for people and groups and nations to disagree with each other. And I am a Protestant. I think it had to happen, but that doesn't mean that every consequence of it was good. And the result of new groups of people emerging who did not have exactly the same moral and metaphysical and theological beliefs led to a new problem. I mean, pluralism has shown up in other places at other times, but it just really intensified in Europe, kind of early 1500s and on into the 1600s, and led to huge, terribly bloody wars between rival political powers who said that they belonged to different religions. And that became a big problem in sort of the public mind. People who thought about such things were worried, well, how can we agree? How can we stop these terrible wars? How can we find agreement that can unite instead of divide to stop this bloodshed? At the same time, the scientific revolution was in full flower, and people were feeling very optimistic about science and its ability to both explain reality, but also maybe tell us about things in new ways. It's not that the medievals didn't think we could know about morality. They went about it through a more philosophical and theological way. But suddenly, there's this public kind of like pan-European desire to find a way to morally unite people to prevent war. And at the same time, this new instrument, this new method for figuring out truth in science. And so what seems to happen is many people started trying that path. Like, oh, let's use science to tell us about right and wrong. Why is it tragic? I think it's tragic because, what makes a story tragic, I think, is when there is some kind of objective that the characters have that is good, but something prevents them from fulfilling it. And James and I both think it would be great if we could overcome the violence that sometimes results from pluralism. That doesn't seem good. It'd be great if we could be united, both in our nation and across the world, and knowing what is right and wrong and good and bad, and that wars would cease. This is a good goal, but trying to achieve this by figuring out the answer with science in a way that you could demonstrate and prove to other people, that cannot work, and that's the failure that makes it part of what makes it a tragedy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And this is why I stopped at the word science when I read the book, because the idea of science that we have is that it is a purely descriptive discipline. It cannot prescribe something, or at least not in the sense in which we think of morality. And when I read through your book, there was this chapter in which you mentioned three levels: level 1 findings, and level 2 and level 3, wherein there is, at least it seems inconceivable to me, I don't know if it's possible, but it seems inconceivable that level 1 findings, which I guess are are whether science can tell us about what is right and what is wrong, objectively what is right and what's wrong, and that's almost impossible. It seems to me to be the case, and that's what you argue there as well. Level 2 would be the case in which you can judge something and say this particular moral doctrine is wrong, or in some cases you might be able to say that that particular theory is wrong. You're not exactly creating a moral standard. You can't make people prescribe to it, but at least you can show that some particular moral doctrine is wrong. Am I getting
Yeah,
that right? And then the level,
basically, yeah.
yeah, and then the level 3 findings would be descriptions of what morality is, and that seems to me something that science is capable of. It seems to me to be that that's how you distinguish these three, and I find that very helpful. But here's the thing: uh, wouldn't any person who started with science, or the with a scientific mindset, have at the back of his mind that since this is a descriptive discipline, why do I even need to start to use it to prescribe something when I know that this is purely a descriptive discipline? This is used to describe patterns in the world and astronomical details and all of that, and not to prescribe something especially so intrinsic as morality. Why would someone think that way, I guess?
That's a great question. I mean, I can only speculate. It's probably different for different people. I went to a conference a few months ago that was designed to gather together some of the leading moral psychologists working in the field today. And I was talking with one of them who gave, this one moral psychologist gave a presentation. The name of the presentation was something like the developmental origins of morality, or something like that. But the talk was just about, it was centered around these experiments that show that very young children will sometimes, like if an adult drops a pen or a toy, the young child will go over and pick up the pen or the toy and hand it back to the adult. And this was taken as an indicator of like the beginnings of morality. And during the lunch break, I was saying, it just doesn't seem clear to me that that is really about morality. I mean, it's something that's important for social life. It's cooperation. The child is trying to cooperate with what he thinks the intentions of the adult are, but you can cooperate with great evil. What if the adult is in the process of administering a lethal injection to someone for no good reason, and the child helps? I mean, it's not moral. It's just something in the realm of the social. And this psychologist, this moral psychologist, she agreed. She's like, yeah, that's right. And she's like, well, maybe morality isn't the best title. And it was so casual. I mean, and I couldn't believe that she was so willing to say, yeah, maybe it's not really about morality at all. And so I don't really know what to make of that. I think maybe many people who work on the science of morality, certainly not all, but many of them, I think they just haven't thought about it very hard. To you and to me, it seems very clear, like, well, there's just the nature of morality is such that, I mean, how could you study it with empirical methods? Like, it's just not the sort of thing that it just wouldn't work. But I think that's a philosophical thought that a lot of scientists, and maybe sometimes even philosophers, don't have. They don't recognize that distinction. And I think it's easy, for people to fall into thinking, oh, well, science is the only sure way of knowing about the world, so it must be able to tell us about morality if morality is real. So I don't know if that's helpful. That's my best guess about part of what's happening.
Yeah. No, that's helpful, and that makes me think because that's the first question. But in the same realm, why would one think that anyone can bridge the is-ought gap? I've tried to wrap my mind around it. I've never been able to come up with an explanation. Obviously, I'm not a philosopher or a psychologist, so there are way better people who might be able to. But still, how can a person bridge the is-ought gap? I guess which is what Hume called it, the is-ought gap. And I keep wondering as to um, even if you find something that is the case, and I guess human flourishing is something that people ought to desire. And the ought comes in there and demolishes the whole thing because why on earth should someone ought? And I keep coming back to that because why ought? And I guess you mentioned that, but I'd like you to expand on that because can science in any way bridge the is-ought gap, or is that a full stream? Is that a pipe dream? Is that ever possible?
I don't think it can. I mean, I think, and I think the reason is just that, people mean many things by science, but the way we mean it in our book, and the way I think it's most helpful to think about it for this conversation is, it's a way of knowing about the world that's closely tied to empirical methods. So like
Empiricism.
the five senses, the five senses, gathering information in a way that you can show to someone else, at least in principle. Nobody has seen all the scientific experiments that give us a scientific picture of reality, but the experiments have been done, and we can conceptually understand how it could work, and that can persuade people. The trouble is that the truth is that not everything that is real can be studied in that way. Not everything that's real can be discovered by the senses and can be picked up and shown to someone else. And morality is one of those things. We're all in contact with good things. We all experience the force of duty and responsibility, of obligation, but we can't sort of grab a piece of it and show someone. We can tell stories that make it evident for people who want to see it, and we can say things like, like a young child, look how precious she is. And people who are not who are not philosophers will agree. But if someone wants to disagree, you're like, oh, really? Why is she precious? Show me the preciousness. Point to the preciousness that's different from, this 30-pound piece of meat or whatever. And you can't. It's very hard to pick that out. But I think it's real. It's just hard to individuate the way we individuate empirical properties. So I don't think there is any way that science can tell us about good and bad and right or wrong. I mean, I think we say some of this in the book. The closest it can get is, or one way it can be involved in sort of the normative or the ethical or the moral is, once we know something moral, something ethical, something good, something we should do, science, of course, can play a role in telling us how we can do that thing, how we can achieve some end.
Right.
But that's not moral, because you can have evil ends, you can have amoral ends. But if you have a neighbor who is sick and you want to help them, that's a good thing to do usually, and science can play a role there. Like, I can cook them a meal or something.
Of helping them. Yeah. But the underlying foundation of wanting to help them, or the fact that you ought to help them, is still above science. It's I guess philosophical.
Yeah, and one point that's related here that I think is very important that we talk a little bit about in the book, but it keeps coming up when I talk to people about this issue. I wonder if we should have said more about it. The is-ought problem, in the way that it's been talked about through the intellectual history, sometimes people will say there's a gap between is and ought, and there's two ways you can understand that. If you just take the way it's said, there's a gap between is and ought, that's very bad. That's not true. I mean, if you imagine like, here are all the is over here, here's what is the case, here's what is true, and there's a gap between that and what should be and what is good, that would be terrible. That would mean that what is, claims about what is good and what we should do are not a part of what's true. And that's false. I mean, that would be a non-objective view of morality. But I think the correct idea is that you have to find out about ethics and morality on their own terms. You can't get from claims that don't involve morality already to claims about morality. Like, you have to kind of start with morality itself. I mean, I think
You
one
have to
example might be,
presuppose a moral standard or something moral before you even start to talk about this.
or I think it's a common thing, not just for morality, but so think about the experience of color. Color is like this. So there, you could be like, let's say someone is born blind and you're talking to them. You could tell them many things about the world. They can learn many things about the world, but they will never be able to know what color is like unless they experience it somehow. Maybe blind people can see color in dreams. I don't know. But unless they have some kind of experience of color, there's no other path to them knowing what red looks like or yellow. And the same is true for morality. You have to learn about it on its own terms, and then you can connect it with other things, but you can't learn about it apart from itself. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. And to add to that, or maybe to go on from there, when people talk about science and trying to use it as this purely empirical discipline to find out about the origins of morality, I wonder, because science itself cannot be in a vacuum, because it has it takes in laws of mathematics, it takes in certain rules of logic, and I guess it to a degree, to an extent, it uses uniformity in nature and all of those sorts of things, and those cannot at least seem to be explained in empirical terms. So so how is it then that you try to use a method that uses empiricism to describe the origins of morality when the method itself cannot stand on its own? It cannot stand in a vacuum. There are these things that encompass it, and those things sort of seem to me to be outside of the realm of that which science can explain. Seems to me to be transcendental, to use those terms. But how did that go?
No, I think you're exactly right. It's a good question. Let me think for a second. I think so. Not everyone, as I'm sure not every scientist is an empiricist, and not every person who thinks that science can answer moral and ethical questions is an empiricist. I think plenty of them who think that you can get oughts from non-oughts, an ought from an is, would say, sure, not everything is empirical, but the stuff that is genuine, the real ways of knowing about the world that are not empirical, are different from what it would be like if we could know about ethics or morality apart from science. So they would say, like, there's a difference between logic, which is not empirical, and mathematics, which is not empirical, and morality, such that we can trust our knowledge of logic and mathematics. It's even though it's not empirical, there's a huge amount of intersubjective agreement between people. It's a fascinating thing to me. I think it's philosophers of mathematics and epistemologists of math study this, and it's really interesting. Like, it's not empirical, but there's a lot of agreement throughout the discipline of mathematics all over the world. There are some areas of disagreement, but it's almost everybody agrees it's objective. It's basically true for logic, although there's more disagreement there, I think. So I think plenty of people who like the science of morality would say, yeah, I'm not an empiricist because I think you can know things about logic and mathematics not from science, but that's where I draw the line. When you go past logic and mathematics into the fuzzy world of metaphysics and morality, and let alone theology, that's people indulging in fantasies, unless we can somehow tie it back to science or math or logic. So that's what I think is going on. There are some really hardcore empiricists out there. Mostly they're in philosophy, and they have a hard time. when I was in grad school in philosophy, one of the books that made the biggest impression on me made the exact argument that you just made. I actually forget what it's called. It's by a guy named Lawrence Bonjour, and the title has, I think, the word empiricism in it. But he basically says, like, you can't be an empiricist because even the scientific method requires you to use logic and mathematics. So how do you explain it? So I think it's a good argument.
Right. Yeah. 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 Because and I find that fascinating, and thank you for the response, because it made me think, and yeah. So the applicability of these laws to physical things also makes you wonder, because the applicability of certain moral laws to, I guess, our physical interactions are also, you might be able to draw a parallel there. But yeah, talking about that, and the way in which science goes about dealing with this, I guess the scientists who might come really close to morality, or the way in which we think about morality, might be the neuroscientists, or those who engage in those sciences. Would that be right? Would they be the ones who might be able to understand how morality works in human minds better than most?
Oh, the neuroscientists. I don't see how. I mean, it's an interest. It's a clear. I think you have to acknowledge it's an interesting field. Joshua Greene, who we talk about in the book, he's done some interesting things showing that it might be true that there are different it is true there are different categories of moral judgments. There are judgments about good and bad consequences, and there are judgments about that are more immediate, and like this is the wrong thing to do, or this is good. There is a distinction there philosophically, conceptually, and he might have shown that you think about these things, you process these things in different parts of your brain. That's interesting. Why is that interesting? I don't know. I don't think it tells us anything about what's right and wrong. His argument, he has to tie it into a lot of hardcore philosophy and a very speculative evolutionary psychology in order to generate from that data something that is interesting for morality itself. He winds up saying, oh, the intuitive moral judgments about what's right and wrong or good and bad, these are holdovers from an earlier point in human evolution.
Age.
Yeah, and this is where people wind up disagreeing with each other. But if we could just stop relying on those kinds of moral judgments and just focus on,
the
running
utilitarian sense.
Yeah, thinking about the consequences of things. Like, that's just calculation. Everybody can agree on that. We can use science and technology. Then we can all agree. I mean, the hard thing for me, like one of the first questions is, yeah, but when you're doing the calculative stuff, you're still relying on a prior notion of good and bad, because you have to know, well, what are the good what are the good consequences? That's right. And so if you try to totally not rely on intuitive judgments, then on what basis will you say that an outcome is good or bad when you're trying to figure it out through prediction or calculation or something? So I mean, again, I don't in any way want to demean the work of neuroscience. It's the brain is the part of the physical world most closely connected with our mind, and it's a mysterious point of connection, and we should know as much about it as we can. I just have seen no reason at all to think that studying that will tell us anything about morality itself or what's good and bad.
I love the way you guys explain that in the book, because at a superficial level, when I heard this argument from Joshua Greene, from somewhere else, I don't know where I heard it from or read it from maybe, but about the I guess he used the old classic trolley experiment in which you've got the five guys, and I love the way you explain it, because when I heard the argument first, it seemed just like, oh yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So in this case, you use your deontological perspective. I guess that's the term for it. And in the other case, you use a more calculated approach to and I guess they call it consequentialism. Is that
sure?
Right? Yeah. So and at first glance, it seemed to make a lot of sense to me, and it seemed to make me think, all right, so this might help us all get along together. And then I read your book, and I realized that, no, hold on a second, there seems to be a lot of things that are assumed here, and a whole lot of things that are going on in the background that might not make this as simple and straightforward as he seems to think it is. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
just one thing I can't remember if this made its way into the book, but when James and I were writing the book, when we got to this section, James made some comment when we were discussing it. It was something like, imagine Joshua Greene talking to a devout Muslim who believes in Sharia law, saying like, well, you just need to give up Sharia law because it's not best for everyone. You know, it infringes on the freedom of the people who live under it. You know, it forces women to dress in a certain way, which denies them their freedom to express themselves. It's like you're assuming so much about what actually is good and bad. It would never ever work. But Joshua Greene is trying to build this utopian theory that can enable everyone in the world to agree. And he just pointed out like this: there's no chance of this practically working.
The argument.
Yeah, people will only even think it might work if they're living in an urban, secular Western environment where they only live around other people who roughly see the world as they do, and they're not thinking about the diversity of moral opinion out there. So no, I agree.
Is huge. Yeah. And your explanation of it in the book was really fascinating, and it made me think a lot. So yeah, so that's one way in which neuroscience, well, is trying to establish some sense of the foundations of morality. Not really a successful quest as we see, but still they're trying to achieve something in that regard. And the other person that I read about was this guy named I don't know if you've heard of him. I'm not exactly sure you mentioned it. A guy called Tomasello, and the social intelligence hypothesis that humans have evolved to be this socially intelligent creatures, sort of ultra social, if you will, and there is this ultra sociality that helps us that in our moral behavior, as opposed to the social behavior of the apes, which are not all that socially intelligent, because while they cooperate, humans seem to have developed an ultra social behavior. Now, I'm not sure if you mentioned the guy in the book, but how do you view people who these are, I guess, evolutionary psychologists who use the arguments about social interactions and people evolving through these uh, millennia-long process and finally reaching this place in which we are now awesome in our moral claims, I guess.
Can you spell his last name?
Tomasello. I guess that's the name.
Oh, Tomasello. Yeah.
Michael Tomasello. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if we cite him. I have seen some of his stuff. It sounds like this hypothesis is something like trying to explain how morality and knowledge of morality could be an adaptive feature. Is that right?
Exactly, an adaptive feature. And because sorry, but just to make the argument clear for those of us who are watching, it seems to me to be the case that almost every single evolutionary psychologist uses some form of the adaptability of something. So we've come in and we've evolved, and now we've got these moral senses within us, but it only explains, even if it does explain, the origins of it. It doesn't explain why we ought to follow it or any of that matter. It just explains that we've somehow reached this particular point in time where these moral values are good. Although why they are good and all of that is still up in the air, I guess, up for grabs.
No, I think that's right. I mean, on this specific hypothesis, I guess I would need a lot more convincing. I mean, I do think that if people knew in a pretty detailed way what they ought to do, how they ought to act toward other people, and people followed that, that would be, I guess it's hard for me to see how it's adaptive. When you think about people living together which they do it pretty much everywhere, there's so much variation. There's so much evil mixed in with the good. There's so much misbehavior of people toward other people.
Yeah.
And we still live together. We're attracted to each other.
Nature is red in tooth and claw.
Nature's red in tooth and claw. And we, it's easier for us to survive when we live together, but that doesn't tell us anything about what's good or bad. I don't know. This kind of argument, it is out there. I don't think we talk about it in the book, but I guess they would have to show that knowing and doing what is right is good for the survival of the species. And I guess my thought is sometimes that will be true and sometimes that will not be true. And I don't know, it depends on how they cash that out. I mean, I think there are tons of cases you could think of. A classic one to me is the lifeboat scenario that philosophers talk about sometimes. You're with other people on a ship, the ship sinks. And so like 5 people wind up in a boat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from land, no way to communicate. You run out of food. You're collecting rainwater to survive. Finally, you realize you have to eat somebody else on the boat if you're going to survive.
Oh, What's the right thing I've heard of this. Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think the right thing to do there is you should all starve to death together. That's the right thing to do. You shouldn't kill one of them and eat so that 4 can survive. And so, I mean, that's I think what morality says there. That doesn't help you survive. It doesn't. There is a connection between morality and survival. I mean, like I said at the very beginning, I think the ultimate root of morality is a good and holy God who created the cosmos and set up the purposes and goals of living organisms so that things might live. But survival isn't guaranteed. And in fact, as a result of, human sin, human evil acts, all humans will die as punishment. And so even in the cosmos, the order that God has set up, there are things that are more important than earthly life. It's a crucial part of morality. And according to God's judgment, all of us have to die,
right.
As a result of that. So, and of course, that's not going to enter into Tomasello's argument, but I think it's good to keep your hand on, well, what really is the case in terms of right and wrong. I would like to think more about that, but that's my kind of immediate take. No. I'd love to hear what you think too about that hypothesis.
Yeah, and this is what I think, because I agree with you on the whole, and maybe I think about what Alvin Plantinga says about evolution and naturalism, because when he talks about evolution and naturalism, he talks about evolutionary naturalism being sort of false, I guess, because how can survival lead to truth-directed beliefs? Mm-hmm. And I've always wondered that, because why should you have to have true beliefs? You only need to have beliefs that help you survive, right? So that's the major goal. What on earth does truth have to do with anything? And I guess Patricia Churchland uses truth, whatever that is, takes the hindmost. I think that was the last part of her quote. This is the quote. The principal chore of brains is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Improvements in sensory motor control confer an evolutionary advantage. A fancier style of representing the world is advantageous as long as it enhances the organism's chance for survival. Truth, whatever that is, takes the hindmost. That's Patricia Churchland. And I guess that's right? I mean, truth, whatever that is, and I find the concept of truth bewildering in an evolutionary perspective, at least an evolutionary naturalistic perspective. So why talk about morality when you can't even have a justification for truth? And I guess that was Darwin's doubt as well, in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, the perspective that Churchland and others who have similar views are coming from, I just think it's taken them many, many years to talk themselves into this. I think it's so preposterous. When you think about the daily activities of a human being, so much of it is bound up with the truth and trying to know what the truth is. We care what other people think about us. We care what our loved ones are doing. We are so curious about reality in ways that far outstrip what's necessary for survival. I think you have to talk yourself into thinking of an imaginary human being who isn't at all like real human beings in order for Churchland's account to make sense. I mean, truth and knowing the truth is so central to human interests and human values that if you try to tell a story about what human beings are like and how we got here that puts truth in the hindmost, that makes truth not an essential part of the story, you've just given a very bad explanation. You've described like an ape that looks like a human being but is not a human being. Think about Patricia Churchland spending thousands of hours writing these books, trying to persuade us what is true about the world. I mean, even her own project it's hard to understand why she would pursue it if her view is correct about the world.
Because why convince anyone of anything at that point?
Right.
It seems to me.
Why does it matter to her? If she's right, why would she be confident that we could figure it out? How, at a more meta level, like it would, if her view is right, it would be an unbelievable coincidence that we could know what's true about the world, that we can even have knowledge. And yet we do. That's a strange fact that cries out for explanation. And
that's a miracle in itself, I guess.
That's right. Maybe one of the best books I've read in the last 5 years, and you may have read it too, is Thomas Nagel's Mind and Cosmos.
Mind and Cosmos. I love it. Yeah.
He's making points just like that, saying, look, there are these really crucial aspects of human beings that would be these just unbelievable coincidences if the Darwinian naturalist view is correct.
If the neo-Darwinian outlook is right, then there are a whole lot of coincidences that you cannot explain. That's so true. And I guess the only person who seems to stand out from this is Sam Harris, who seems to have some sense of an idea of moral realism, that there are objective truths out there. He seems to keep on saying that, and I guess he does say that in his book, The Moral Landscape. But I wonder how does moral realism work in his framework? How does that work in his worldview?
Because he does seem to be a naturalist otherwise? Is that why you're asking? Like, it seems like there would be a tension.
Because assuming that his worldview is naturalism, and I think that is, although they seem to have, atheists have a lot of worldviews, and I'm not going to assume he has one, but ultimately he doesn't ascribe to any theistic conception of the universe. So for the sake of argument, let's assume naturalism. And with that as an assumption, how does he ascribe to moral realism? That's something that's always confused me.
So I'm going to tell you what I think, because I followed him over the years. I think his book was one of the first books that we read when we were working on Science of the Good, and he's maybe the most public face of that question.
Just to add this, and I'm sorry for interrupting. I won't.
Oh no.
But this book is also pretty popular here. Among the books from the new atheists that are popular in Kerala, one of that is The Moral Landscape, and the other is Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion.
Okay.
These are the books that are popular here, and that the Yukthivadhis that I mentioned earlier, the rationalists, if you will, who love these books, and these are the foundations of the urban technocratic society that we are now in.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so that's. I'm glad we're talking. Sam Harris is interesting, as you said, for a number of reasons, because he's different. We haven't really talked about moral nihilism yet. I mean, I think in almost every case, the philosophers who talk as though you can figure out what we ought to do from science, they don't actually believe in morality. This is going to help the answer to the following discussion that comes from your question. They use the language of morality. They use moral terms like ought and good and evil and so forth. But the philosophers who are working here, they're pretty consistent. They realize, according to my view, my reductive naturalist view, there isn't anything in reality that could be an objective value there couldn't be any such thing as a normative obligation to do something, to care for someone or something like that. That doesn't make sense. How could you build that out of the tiny physical properties that build up reality? Forces and gravity and these kinds of things. But because they are humans, they find it very useful to use those terms. And so when they say, like, here's how science can tell us how to live, what they really mean is we have things that we as individuals or we as a society want to do. We have goals, and these goals, they're amoral because they don't think morality is real. But we use the term good for our goals, like, oh, I want to make $1 million or whatever. And so we want that, and so people often fall into saying that whatever they want is good. And science and technology can help us achieve our goals. And so that's really what so many of who we call the new moral scientists, that's really what they mean. So there's the genuine, like, academic inquiry question, like, can science tell us about good and bad? No, it can't. But many of the people who say that it can, they actually agree with that conceptual point that you and I made earlier, but that, how could empirical methods tell us about value or duty? They would agree with that distinction. Then they would say, yeah, but we just mean something different by good. Joshua Greene is very clear about this in his dissertation. I don't know if it's been published yet, but it really explains so much about his subsequent work. He's very clear, like, we just have to agree to change the meanings of moral terms. And it's in terms of getting what we want instead of an independent realm of good and bad. So coming back to Harris is the one philosopher, the one new moral scientist who seems to be different. I mean, he's very clear, like, no, he's like, I think some things are objectively good. That's sort of the whole part of the whole point of his book. That book, The Moral Landscape, the first third of it, I think is great. He's arguing for objective morality and gives some good arguments. But then, he goes on to try to say, and we can learn about this in the same way we can learn about other things using, neuroscience or what have you. Here's what I think happened. The beginning of his intellectual life, he was in neuroscience, or maybe he was doing philosophy as an undergrad, but when he became a professional, his roots were in science. And I think he still didn't understand the philosophical points he was talking about very well. And in fact, he's actually clear about that he does it in this book. There are footnotes where he says, like, he kind of dismisses all of philosophical literature as being arguing over, trivial points. Much of it is, I agree, but he hadn't read enough of it.
Angels on a pin, I guess.
Yeah, he didn't really understand what he was talking about. And I think he has not come out and said that, but I think that he knows it because he doesn't seem to want to talk about that earlier project as much. And some good friends of his, I don't know if you know this physicist, Sean Carroll, who's
the quantum physicist.
Yeah. There was a discussion or a debate that Sean Carroll and Sam Harris did maybe 3 years ago, where Carroll makes the same point. He's like, no, I mean, if morality is objective, you can't figure it out scientifically. Like what you're trying to do in the moral landscape in this, like the second half of it can't work. And Harris does not have a good response. Carroll, still Harris doesn't say, you're right, I'm wrong, it's a failed project. But it seems like it seems that he is appreciating that he wasn't right in that book and he's moved on to other things. And I think this is a dangerous game, but he is a public figure. He does not make his living from the typical way that academics do by getting some, job as a teacher or a researcher and then publishing books, and his compensation is tied to that. It's a very different model for him. He has a podcast that hundreds of thousands of people listen to, and he gives talks that people pay to come see. So it would be very bad for his brand for him to say, I was wrong about this. So I think this is speculation, but I think he knows it, but I think the consequences are too grave for him to admit it. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my suspicion.
Yeah, a lot of it seems to me to be similar to how Lawrence Krauss talks about nothing in his book, The Universe from Nothing.
Yeah.
Because that's another book that's confused me. A brilliant man, but nothing. I mean, I've still not gotten over his idea of nothing, which fascinates me no end.
No, I agree. That's an even more egregious case of someone talking about something they don't understand. There's an amazing and pretty brief review of that book
Oh,
by
yeah. The New York Times, was it in the New York Times or
David
somewhere
Albert.
else?
Is it? I can't
Oh,
remember where it
yeah.
was
Oh, yeah,
published.
yeah. David Albert, the philosopher, physicist.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is just one of the best. I mean, it's touching, it's amusing, and it just exactly pinpoints the huge mistake at the core of Krauss's book. It's one of the best book reviews I've ever read.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I remember that. I remember reading that when I first encountered this book, and I was wondering what's nothing, and I kept hearing this argument, nothing is what rocks dream of, and and it clearly wasn't what rocks dreamt of in his book. So yeah, that's one point that I was fascinated by, and all of these, I guess, new atheists and moral scientists seem to want to define certain terms that in iffy ways to to make that point. But yeah, but coming back to the idea of preferences and our tastes, for example, because ultimately it seems to me to come to the point of taste. Morality seems to me to come to the point of I kind of feel like this is right. That seems to me to be how a lot of people in Western society, and increasingly so in the East, see morality. Mm, if divorced from a transcendent perspective, then it seems to me that it's what I feel is right. It's preferences more than anything else. And I guess that's what drives a lot of the new atheist arguments, because they want it to be preferences, but they can't just place it there because you can't say it's all preference and leave it there. So that, I guess, that's what makes them write these books and attach some sort of scientific background to these ideas, because ultimately it's still preferences.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of the new atheists, I mean, most of the new atheists, uh, they kind of have one foot in serious academic work and the other foot in the public eye.
Pop
Um,
culture.
yeah, popular culture. And you know, like Sam Harris, at least early in his career, this is probably true for Dawkins too. I've read less of Dawkins. I think sometimes they don't they don't really understand morality well enough to see tensions in their own view, because very often the new atheist line, it's a very moral view. It's something like, your big motivation for being a new atheist is um, a responsibility to believe what is true and stop believing in childish fantasies.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah,
you need
yeah.
to understand the way the world really is by studying science and logic, and stop believing in dangerous false religion.
Yes.
And so and that's why they often have a very scolding tone, because they're
Right. Yeah. Be a
rebuking
sky
people
daddy.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and then making fun of people, and you know, Harris especially, and Dawkins at times, you know, they seem to think that religion is, it's not just false, but it's very dangerous, and it's
Ah,
an
yeah.
existential threat to humankind.
Right.
And
So that's
so,
the motivation.
yeah, it's a big part of it. But I think that one of the deepest motivations is just, and this is good, like, you have, you know, you should believe the truth. You
Right.
shouldn't believe things just because they make you feel good.
Yeah.
I think they just have some of these folks haven't dug deeply enough to see, well, if the naturalist metaphysic is correct, that I think I accept, then really there isn't any such thing as
As
good and bad.
proof.
There's no such thing
Or
as responsibility. Or yeah, you're right. I mean, fundamentally, or even truth, um, because, you know, truth requires, you know, there being
a
some
teleology,
state.
I guess. Because
Yeah, what?
yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's a weird thing. Like, there has to be something to be true. Like, it could be a claim in your mind, or um, you know, they would have to say, well, what are the things that are true, and how could we tell? There are a few. I don't think there are any new atheists who are open about this, because they would lose their whole motivation for being a new atheist. But there are plenty. There are naturalists who recognize this. You know, Alex Rosenberg is probably the best example, who wrote the book "The Atheist's Guide to Reality," or "An Atheist's Guide to
Yeah,
Reality."
yeah. I've seen that
He
somewhere.
is
Yeah.
he's taken naturalism, and he's just followed it all the way down. In the end, he says, you know, there's no rationality. Um, it could, you know, how could there there can't be intentionality, like thoughts couldn't be about something, because how can
Yeah,
you build
yeah,
aboutness out of physical parts? And if there's no aboutness, then there can't be the thought. And if there can't be thought, there can't be rationality. And if there's not no rationality, then there's no truth that anybody could know about. But the new atheists are very superficial in terms of the actual philosophy, their philosophical understanding.
yeah. I've noticed that a lot. Even though I'm not all that well versed, it seems to me to be the case that it's very superficial, and the arguments are, at least for the most part, very superficial. It tugs at you at the first level. It seems, yeah, and then when you think a bit more about it, they haven't gone deep enough. It's still at the basic level, but I guess it gets a lot of views. Because even here, a lot of people love these books and read these books, and so yeah, they.
Well, and something you said, this may have been right before we actually started the interview, but you mentioned that the growing secularism in Kerala, where you live,
Yeah, yeah,
the context you describe is one where people are coming more and more to the city. They're getting involved
yeah,
with. You didn't say this, but I assume like there are jobs that involve using the internet. You're working in
yeah.
an
The IT
office.
park. We've got the techno park, and that's where a lot of people are. That's the urban community. That's the young millennial community,
Okay,
and yeah, yeah. That's
and
the
that's
culture.
this is something that I was just coming to see when James and I were writing the book, and now I realized how monumental of an issue it is. I mean, I think for many people who are secular today, I think the biggest driving force isn't anything that they have views that reflect their view of the world, but I don't think it was arguments that persuaded them. I think it was their experience of the world. And their experience of the world is one where they live in a city, so they're mostly cut off from nature. The city is also a place where people come to the city, and when they come to the city, they have to cut ties with their family, with their traditional religion, with the traditions of their ancestors. And so people come from many different traditions and many different families, and they come to the city. And so it's like everybody starts over again. And there's no longer any tie or culture that gives meaning to their life or explains the world to them. And their motivation in the city is to get a good job and to make money, which is fine. That's understandable why people want those things. And so they accidentally wind up embracing a new value system that's based around, climbing a ladder of success and appearing as having higher status to your peers and your colleagues, and acquiring more material wealth. And what basically seems like it inevitably happens when people come to a city is it's almost impossible to avoid taking on a secular view or experiencing like a secularization of the view that you had. It's very hard to hold on to a traditional belief system. And to me, that is like when you are thinking about secularism or you're talking with people and you're trying to persuade them, it's such a difficult task because your real opponent is not an argument. Your real opponent is an economic system,
The
and a way
culture
of
at large.
life.
Yeah.
And that is, what can you or I do? I'm not saying these are bad things. It's just there's a logic that seems to be built into the physical space and the economy that is I think the primary driver of secularism. It's, I don't know.
This is
It's
so true.
discouraging to think about.
Yeah, this is because we've had people who live in close, tight-knit communities, and that used to be the way. But India became more and more wealthy as the economic drive opened up, as our economy opened up in the 1990s, and people started to move towards cities and urban areas. And with that also came the rise of secularism, not overtly, but a very a sort of undercurrent of secularism, if you will. And towards the 2010 and now even in 2020, we now have people who are effectively atheistic. Now they might hold to an idea of the religion that they had because it's still their root, but that's just
Right.
there. It has no practical. There's no practical use of the religion. That's just there. That's in their name. But apart from that, it's effectively atheistic. And the culture, well, it's almost a mirror image of what goes on in the US, what goes on in the West. So it's the same thing. It's the same ideals that you imbibe, and it's well then you've got to read their books, and I guess that's where Dawkins and Harris comes in. But yeah, that's the culture. That's where the culture is going to, and yeah. So as Christians, we dialogue with people, and yeah, we increasingly come up with people who, like you mentioned, are not persuaded as much by arguments, because that's not the foundation. That's not what drives them in this culture. It's something else entirely. It's this new way of life. It's this economic utopia, if you will. It's a new way of living that's opened up to them. That was really not the case 10, 20 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah, it seems that you're interested in apologetics, and I think that this dynamic requires a change in how people go about thinking it and practicing apologetics. I mean, how do you reach someone who is a part of the secular, urban sphere? And just as a side note, I mean, I think the internet, I see it as it's sort of like, it works sort of like a giant global city that anybody can join if they have internet access. I mean, the things that the way it changes people's life and habits, it resembles, I think, in many ways, urbanization. But now, because now you can work from online and you can interact with people more and more online instead of wherever you happen to actually physically be. And so the internet is sort of like a global city that anyone can be a part of now. But how do you reach people? I mean, I don't know the answer. The only thing that I think works doesn't work very well on a mass scale, and that I think is you try to model a different way of life where you put friendship and love and hospitality above status and career and image. And the secular urban way of life is actually, it's very inhospitable. It's a hard life. It's a shallow life. Pursuing money and doing whatever it takes to climb a ladder to attain a higher status, it's not fulfilling, and it causes people to feel depressed and anxious. And so I think the best tactic for Christians is to become friends with people, and not everyone will be open to that, because friendship is, from a certain perspective, a huge waste of time. Why would you spend so much time with this one person if it's not advancing your career? It's just
when I can climb the corporate ladder, why on earth should I?
That's right.
Should I invest time? Yeah.
But people need friendship. They need companions, and I think probably people are in general more lonely now than they've ever been in the history of the world. It's a hilarious thing to think about,
especially in the West, I guess, because it seems to me that they're way more isolated than those of us here. Although I guess we're moving in that direction, but it's
coming for you, Kieran. I don't live in a city. I live in the suburbs of a small town. But even where I live, and this is the urbanizing effects of the internet. On the small street where I live, half the people I never see, because they work from home or they go to school, and then they spend all their time online. And I don't think playing Fortnite or games on their gaming system, I don't think that's real companionship. And so I see loneliness around me too. Anyways, all that to say, we live in a different landscape than, like, I'd say 30 or 40 years ago. And I think apologists are recognizing this, but something I've been thinking about recently.
Because my father used to tell me about the time he spent with his family, which is a very close-knit, huge family. These families that are traditional, and we came from that kind of family, but now we are a nuclear set. But before that, he used to live with all of his aunts and his great uncles and all of that, and this was huge commune. And that's how life was in Kerala until very recently. But with this generation, with my own, the millennial generation, it stopped. Because my dad, he lived in a rural area, which is an awesome area, but it's kind of far removed from the city where I am in right now. And he came in with his mom to this town where we are now because of economic opportunities and all of that. Now we're here, but it's not the same. It's entirely different. And he tells us a story of how it was back in the day when it was this commune, and all of these people would gather together, and there was this shared sense of moral duty and responsibility. Not that he would use those terms, but yeah, you know what I mean. So that's how our society has changed very recently. But yeah, that's how it's changed, and it keeps on changing as people move from my own city to west, because India has a lot of migration, especially
Hmm.
Kerala. The people from my state would go to the UK, the US, and they become even more isolated with just them or
Yeah.
maybe their own partner, and it keeps getting, yeah, that's the move, and it's all very similar, I guess, to how the West would see the West is right now. That's the way in which we are moving the urban millennial population.
Yeah. I mean, I
So
think
yeah,
it's strange how these things happen. They seem to get their own sort of momentum, and it's hard for anyone to opt out. I mean, at this point, if you want your nation to be a part of the global economy, it seems like people have to be online. They have to be willing to come to cities, um, or the great city of the internet,
right.
to work. And so many of
Or
these
maybe even the
dynamics.
metaverse, I guess.
Yes, no, exactly. I think that's the next step. I mean, I hope it fails. I hope the project fails terribly, but I'm not sure that it will. I mean, when I see how willing people are to spend 16 hours a day online, um, and when I see the interest people have in, you know I don't know if you're experiencing this in Kerala, but in the US, especially in the cities, people wish they had absolute control over their bodies and every aspect of their identity. They wish they could
Oh yeah, I
change their
understand
gender
the
at
idea.
will, their
Yeah, yeah,
physical appearance, and the metaverse will let them do that. And so I think the appeal is going to be strong for many people. So yeah, I mean, the consequences of something like the metaverse becoming widespread are beyond reckoning, but I'm sure it won't be good.
yeah. I've heard a lot of arguments about that, and I've tried to understand what it would mean, what the consequences of this idea of the metaverse would be, and it is mind-boggling. And I guess yeah, it would certainly would have ill effects on society. So yeah, that's one part to think of. But here's the other aspect of all of this, and we talked about preferences, and that's how we ended up to here.
Oh, sorry.
But
Yeah, I got
no,
terribly
yeah,
sidetracked.
no, it's fun because yeah, I love the interaction about this. But here's the thing: emotivism is something that I thought I'd ask you about, because if it is indeed the case that preferences are the driving force of moral decisions and behaviors, emotivism might be the root word. Alistair McIntyre, I guess, used that term to talk about culture,
Hmm.
and the moral desires of the culture, which is basically emotivism. And is that what we see right now? Is it emotivism that's the driving force of moral behavior today? Is it what your emotional
Hmm.
preferences is? Because it seems to me the case, at least on some level.
It's a great question. I mean, I think a good project for anyone, and I'm sure people are doing this, I just haven't seen it, is a really detailed analysis at trying to, or attempt at describing um, the current ethical system in place, or there's probably more than one, but what is the current ethical perspective for, say, people who live in urban areas or people who live in rural areas? It's going to vary by geographic location and tradition and so forth. But in the popular discourse, in the public eye, coming from the academy and from big cities, I'm not sure that it is emotivism. I mean, this is something I've been thinking not as diligently as I should have, but I have been thinking about it a little bit. People will say, "Oh, I feel like this," or "I feel like that." They'll use the language of emotion. But if regular people really were emotivists, then they would have to recognize, well, what I think is good, what I think is bad, what I think I ought to do. These are just my subjective feelings, and as such, they have no claim on anyone else. But that's not how people talk. It seems to me. I think that what seems closer to how people act is they think their feelings have very, very strong objective reality and
Yeah,
objective validity. How, again, this is kind of an extreme example, but it's very central to the public discussion where I live now. How dare you tell me that I am a man because I feel like I'm a woman, and that trumps, the biology that I was born with or the opinions of my society. It's not just, well, I feel differently, and so I'm going to live differently. It's a demand that seems to like it's coming from a sense of an objective reality. Like, no, I am a woman, and you have to refer to me as a woman and treat me like a woman because I feel like one. And so I don't. It's hard for me to see that in actual ethical practice today, at elite levels, that emotivism is what's happening. I don't think that's it. I think that the view is, I'm not sure the view that's out there is coherent, but it puts a high objective validity on these certain kinds of feelings as like pathways to reality. It's like you as the individual have privileged access to who you are, and everyone else has a responsibility to respect your feelings about that. That's my impression.
This is so intriguing because I read an argument about this, because when people say that the transgender movement, in the movement, it's all subjective. There's this argument that no, there is a metaphysic attached to it, because you can't. It seems, in fact, there is an even larger metaphysic, because you're saying that your biology is not as important as this metaphysic, as this way in which you feel. So it's transcendent, all right. It's in some cases spiritual, I guess. So it certainly has this metaphysical aspect. There's no clue as to what it is, but yeah, and I see that, and I forget who made the case. Was it Ryan Anderson? But anyway, yeah, I see the point, and it seems to me that it's the connection between identity and the feeling that you have, because it's not just that you have this preference, it's that it's so connected to who you are as a person, that any objection to it is an accusation, not just towards that preference, but towards you as a person, to you as an individual. And that is so visceral, that evokes such a visceral emotion from you, that you cannot just stay there. You have to respond, because you're not just attacking my preference, you're attacking me as a person. There is this mix of identity with the preference that I guess makes things a whole lot difficult.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, yeah, I feel I have less to say here. It's such an important issue, but I haven't thought as much about it or read as much about it. I mean, I do observe that connection between, something that you place a great deal of value in your identity. I guess that's always there, but but maybe the way in which the identity is understood has shifted a little bit. I mean, I'm a man, and if someone said that I was a woman, I would disagree with them. I don't know how angry I would become. Maybe I would have to experience it to find out. I guess I see my identity in other terms. I'm just thinking out loud. But no, I think that connection between identity or sense of self-identity and deep-seated value is strong. And it is a driver for everyone. Maybe just the aspect under which you understand your identity varies for different people. I'm not sure. I don't have a lot of helpfulness. Yeah.
But denial of biological reality does seem to be a huge issue, and of course theological reality as a whole, because it is the case that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and to claim otherwise seems to me to be, well, wrong. But I guess wrong is the term that's that's not really helpful when you are in a culture that has no objective grounds for morality. But yeah, and
I'm sorry, you go ahead.
The only reason I said "and" was because there's this connection I want to draw between preferences and something that Carl Trueman mentioned in his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, in which he drew our attention to this particular, and I loved it. It was this article by Thomas de Quincey on the aesthetic value of murder, on the aesthetics of murder, because even in Macbeth, and he mentions Macbeth, another place in which you you find sympathy for the perpetrator as well as for the victim. And to evoke sympathy for the perpetrator, to evoke sympathy for someone who's just committed a murder, is not an easy task. And yet, authors seem to be able to do it. And your ability to have sympathy for this murderer, who is in fact objectively a murderer, uh, and makes a strong case for the aesthetic value of morality, because if a culture is purely motivistic, then it can lead to uh, morality being an aesthetic exercise more than anything else. That was the connection, and I guess that really fascinated me, because that made me think, well, wow, think about a culture that has its basis on preferences, but you mentioned that that's not just the case. But even so, assuming that there is some connection between morality and preferences, and the idea of preferences being so attuned to our tastes, where would that lead a person? Because, like
Yeah.
Quincy mentioned.
No, I mean, I think the connection between aesthetics and ethics, I mean, there's a strong one. And I don't think I have much that's helpful to say here, but, you know, it's clear to me that beauty is a component of ethics. Maybe for just about everyone. At least I think we recognize beauty as good, and good is in the realm of ethics.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know, it's beauty is physical beauty, at least, is, you know, it's not the highest good, but plenty of people in all kinds of cultures will elevate certain kinds of aesthetic beauty above, you know, much else.
Yeah. Yeah. True.
And so, no, yeah, I feel like I don't have a lot of great thoughts here, but I think there is a connection in terms of what a specific connection to emotivism. I think it would make it easier to have a sort of an aesthetic based ethics, because if you're an emotivist, there are no prescriptions for what your ethical view should be. You know, emotivism is just an analysis of what is happening when we seem to be making moral judgments.
Yeah.
Because you know, it's like, well, I'm a naturalist, and there couldn't be any such thing as goodness or value or duty. So what's going on when we say that's good or that's bad? Oh, we must just be expressing a preference or making a statement like, you know, yay for beauty, or yay for, or, you know, yay for this person, boo on this person, you know. So it doesn't tell you what you should have good feelings and bad feelings about. It just tells you what's happening when you have those feelings,
Yeah.
or when you
Yeah.
try to say things
Yeah.
are good or bad. So to me, emotivism feels like kind of an empty vessel that anything can be put into. You can like anything, and then you know, build an emotivist ethics off of it.
And that's because, is there any prescription? Does anyone follow a because at least on a superficial level, no one seems to have a prescription for what one ought to do. It's just
On
how
emotivism.
one, yeah, on emotivism. It's just how one feels, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I haven't read enough of their theory to know what they would say. They
Right.
might say things like, well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to see how it would sort of inevitably collapse into kind of dynamics of power. You know, we can
Yeah.
all say, I like this, I don't like this. So who gets their way? You know, the person who has the might to make it
Yeah.
so, or the person with enough prestige that everyone else will agree with him. But yeah, this is, you're just hearing like my off the cuff thoughts. I have not read or thought deeply about this.
Yeah.
This may
Yeah.
be
No,
garbage.
because no, because that seems to me that's exactly how the West goes. Because there really isn't much of transcendent authority in modern popular West, is there? I mean, it seems that almost all authority is abandoned, and it's just, well, there is a magisterium. It's just that it's the scientists who are the arbiters of truth, I guess. Would that be right? And if
Yeah,
that
no,
is the
that's a great
case,
question. Yeah, I mean, I think this is real controversial territory here, but
yeah, probably.
and this is far outside my area of expertise. But my impression is they're sort of different kingdoms, if you will. There's the kingdom of what you might call the ruling elites in the U.S. And it's people who work in the academy, in the government, who have high-paying jobs in urban areas. And this isn't true for all of them, but there's sort of a prevailing ethical outlook there. And it's what you might call the meritocracy. It's very secular, as you and I have been talking about. It's oriented around high faith in science. It's, to these people, it's very important to have status and power. And they're less interested in many of the traditional values, just because they've chosen a path that can move them around the world very easily between urban centers in pursuit of the things they think are valuable, powerful positions and money. And so that's sort of one, you might call it a moral order. And then people who live outside of these areas who work, more ordinary labor type jobs. You build houses, you're a plumber, you sell things at the mall or at a store, you live in a smaller town or in a rural area. It's much more, I think, variable to what the local culture is like. I mean, I'm sorry, I lost the train of thought. What was the issue we were talking about? I distracted myself. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just asking you about the scientists being the arbiter of truth in the
Right.
West. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean this. So one kind of lens through which to see this in my country is with COVID-19. A lot of these fault lines have appeared, and so the kind of urban elites, they claim to have a very high view of science. And people who live in more outside of the urban areas, the suburbanites, the rural folks, they're seen as having a low view of science, and this shows up as in terms of how people react to public health mandates regarding COVID, coronavirus. And it's true that the urban elites say that they are all about following science. I think if you look at it closely, it's not clear that's the case. When they do, many of them are scientists, but at least as important to them is maintaining political power. Yeah. And science is a fantastic tool for them to do that. I think it matters in many cases less what science is saying and more that everyone else is following whatever the scientists say, because that's a means for, well, in sociology you would call it social control. And when people disagree with what science seems to be saying, it makes the ruling elites, furious because they're losing sort of a powerful tool. I'm not trying to say that the people who disagree with the public health science are right. I'm saying this seems to be the social dynamic.
The cultural tensions, I see that, and I guess it's conservative and liberal, and the tensions
very often
that are driven there. And here's a question. I read somewhere that the American Psychological Association has put out that gender is not just binary, but that it's actually a spectrum. Now, I've seen many people make that argument. Many politicians in America make that argument, not just in America, but outside of America. But if the American Psychological Association would put something out like that, and I don't know if that's the case, but if that is true, how does that? Because that seems to me a point in which power is involved, because it seems very hard to me to understand how you can go from biological reality of binary sexes to what is seemingly a multiplicity of genders and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is and I'm way outside of my area of knowledge here, but I do have thoughts. So we're just talking. I mean, to me, there are at least two issues here. One is the American Psychological Association. They're not only interested in saying what the sober scientific truth is. I mean, it's a huge collection of academics. Academics are almost monolithically on one end of the political spectrum. There, this institution, almost all the people who are part of it are progressives.
That in itself is quite a question. Why is it that almost all of them end up on one end of the political spectrum?
Yeah, that's a very deep question that I don't have good answers to. I mean, some of it is kind of a snowball effect. Like the academy somehow became more liberal and then progressive, and so
Yeah.
that makes it more likely that you'll become one if you
Peer
join
pressure
that
as well, joining
guild.
in some place.
But how did it become so originally? I don't have good thoughts there. I don't
Right.
know. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
but going back to the APA, I mean, so this is a huge group of professional progressive people. So they move along with what the progressive mores and norms are. And so the driver here for them is not just science. Science plays a role, but it's such a huge sort of value center for the far left progressive perspective that it's not surprising to me that they would say that. However, and I think you were hinting at this in what you were just saying. I mean, it's not clear to me that gender is a scientific issue. Sex is, biological sex is, but biological sex, I'm not a scientist here, I'm not a biologist, but from reading on Wikipedia, there are gray areas. There are different factors that go into assessing whether someone is male or female, and those factors can occur or not occur in various degrees. And so I'm not convinced that science can sort of settle the gender question. I think it's fundamentally a metaphysical issue. Now, I'm not trying to defend the APA because that was not their motivation. They're not good philosophers. They're not saying this is outside of our realm to adjudicate. They're not saying that. Their motivations are totally ideological.
Right.
But I think, and probably there are people doing good work in gender. I just haven't read it. I just think, if you are kind of a traditional Christian, then I think the approach should be something like, in the beginning, God made them male and female, but I think there is a gender component to that that's tied into the teleology.
Yeah.
This is why I think Aristotle is such a genius. I think he was able to discern the reality of a teleological order in nature. And I think that ties in very nicely with a classic Christian perspective. And so I think Christians should say, well, gender was something that God teleologically oriented the sexes toward. And thinking about it in that framework, I think could be helpful.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. The thing I think about is the fact that while it certainly is the case that there are there is the masculinity and femininity, how does that change biological reality? That's the only thing that I'm concerned about, because it certainly is the case that there would be effeminate men and there would be more masculine females, but they are still females and the other are still men. And when you shift the category and make effeminate men female, that's where I guess the question comes to ontology. And now it's not just about your preference or the way in which you react or in which how the society around you has shifted you. That's not the case. We certainly agree that there certainly are people who might exhibit a more feminine side while being male, or may exhibit a more masculine side while being female. But we still mention biological reality, the dualistic nature of it, the binary nature of it, and when you change that seems to me to be problematic. So I guess, and I guess when huge associations and scientists and people seem to vouch for this view of reality being so confusing, then I guess there is a problem. So, and I wonder if the underlying motivation for all of this, or the underlying reason for all of this, is this lack of any transcendent view of morality, when all of this is just subjective and subject to preferences. Is that why all of this is happening in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the conditions you're describing seem crucial. What I think about, though, is they don't seem sufficient to explain this particular phenomenon. Like elevating the role of human preference in finding a way of life, believing that we have so much control over choosing our identity. That's one issue, but why would it settle on gender factors? I don't know the answer there. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's sort of like
yeah.
these conditions about the role of preferences in the evacuation of the transcendent. This is sort of like an aquarium. But what goes in the aquarium? What kind of fish? I don't know.
Yeah.
For some reason, the
Yeah.
fish we wound up with is gender fluidity or voluntaristic gender. Like, I can choose what gender I am. That would be I've not read anything about that. Maybe you have. Like, why has this emerged as one of, if not the hot button issue where the interest is occurring? I don't know. I don't have a theory there or a story.
Yeah, I think Al Truman addresses some of that in his book, but yeah, it's something that really fascinates me, and yeah, that's why. And I wondered if the grounds for all of this is this lack of any transcendent source of morality, and I guess it's part of it. But yeah, you're right. It is confusing as to why this is the expression of this lack of transcendence. Why this particular revolution, to call it that. I don't know if you ought to call it a revolution, but I guess why that is the primary exhibition of a lack of transcendence of this modern age in which we live.
So you're saying Truman talks a little bit about why gender in particular? I need to read this book. I've been hearing great things.
It's a great book. I love the book. He starts off with, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body. How does that make sense in today's world? How on earth does that sentence make sense? Because obviously, if you lived in the 80s, it's not going to make sense. At least no one here, and I don't think many people in the West would have. Maybe I don't think a lot of people would have understood what the statement even meant. I'm a man trapped in a woman's body. But
well, even worse, just briefly, when you used to encounter that phenomenon, it was in the context of like movies about weird serial killers. Like, I don't know if you ever saw Silence of the Lambs. The serial killer in that movie is trying to become a woman. I don't think they would make a movie like that today. But so that's for a little context of how that I'm a woman trapped in a man's body would have been seen 30 years ago. That's very interesting.
Yeah, because and in this society, in this culture where morality is where it's so devoid of morality, we go on to artificial intelligence and ethics. So if you are such a lack, if there is no basis for you to judge anything, and it's all based on well, if not just preferences, on a whole lot of factors that are really placed in some kind of vacuum, and you have no idea where you're going, how is it that you're going to be able to create artificial intelligence with ethical values? Because that certainly is the case, and that would be the case with self-driving cars. That would be the case with a whole lot of things that we're going to deal with, especially in the future. And even now, when we've got algorithms galore that will take you to this and that based on certain ethical principles that the AI has understood, has been programmed to learn. So how is it possible? How can you arrive at ethics for AI in this culture? And that's the question that I guess is.
No, that's a great. I've not thought about that. Yeah. I mean, I guess you there's so many levels here. It's going to be a conundrum. The one of the problems with ethics in our culture is we live in or at least where you live too. There's to some degree it's pluralist. There's disagreement.
Yeah.
And so how can ethical AI, handle the problem of pluralism? It's unclear. We ordinary real humans don't seem to handle it very well. I mean, it's good that we have freedom to some degree of freedom in what we believe in the value systems that we adhere to, but how does that intersect with AI? It's a great question, Kieran. I don't know.
Yeah. There are these articles in Medium when I guess you use supervised learning for AI, and when you use supervised learning for it, you would certainly have to have this sample and this control group, and when you have that's the area of that's the problem, because unless you have this specific group of Harvard educated US guys, that's a very small subset, and they probably would have a uniform moral code, but that's not going to help you when you move out. So What are
Have
you
you
gonna
seen
face?
this? Have you seen this website? I think it's called Delphi.
Because basing it on the Delphic Oracle. So,
Well,
uh,
it's an early AI, or it's an AI program that basically crawls the web or portions of the web to see what people say is good and bad. So you can ask
yeah,
it a question like, is
and
it
it'll say it
wrong
is
to?
wrong, it is right,
Yeah,
murder is wrong. Yeah, yeah,
but it doesn't. But it's it gets the answer wrong so many times. It's kind of funny, It's if you say like I can't remember that I was playing with some of my colleagues, but it's if you say like is it wrong? Um, I can't remember. It's like, is it wrong to kill a Republican? It will say yes. It's like, but if you say like, you're like, is it wrong to? I can't remember. It's very easy to trick, and
yeah,
so
yeah,
it's
yeah,
again, people will say, well, it's the early days. We haven't got the bugs out yet. But the principle is what you're describing. Like it's sort of emergent, or it's surfing on what other people are saying, and so it's only going to, if that's the mechanism by which it arrives at moral statements, it's just gonna be as good or bad as we are. They would have to level up to something. I mean,
and
they would have to reduplicate the human moral sense, and
yeah,
then
and on what basis, I guess, would one ask? Because what is the
it's
human
not
moral sense
empirical.
apart from, yeah, it's not empirical. So what is
How
it
can they
apart
build
from
it?
any
Yeah.
revelational sense? Yeah, yeah. So I I'm amazed at how people seem to want to carry this forward, and yet this is such a dangerous idea, because if you have no conception of right and wrong, and you're using uh, appeal to majority. But even that is not the
Mhm.
case, because you're not even appealing to majority, you're appealing to a particular control group, and their own moral values might not even be in sync. So it is a mind-boggling question. But I guess it's one of the modern facets of society in which we live. But yeah, so here's one more thing that I wanted to ask you. You and Dr. James Davison Hunter were with a discussion with Dr. Michael Shermer.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and he mentioned something, and that got me thinking. So here's the thing that he mentioned. He was talking about d divine command theory, and he said, "Well, all right. So it's not obvious that science can help us in morality, but certainly theistic conceptions cannot help us either, because divine command theory is obviously out the out the table." So yeah, and a friend of mine, he made this argument. It was not in relation to this, but he talked about divine moral realism, or in some sense, in which he said, no, that's not the case. We are covenantly bound to our Creator, and so our psychology has a function, has a telos, and that's where the ought comes from. So it's not divine command theory. It's more like we have a covenant relationship with the Creator, and we are there is this we our function, or rather the normativity is part of the function theory of normativity. I think that's what people call it.
Oh.
So if you've got a knife, and its function is to cut stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, when it does the thing that's supposed to do, yeah, that's great. And I guess in that sense, you've got men and women made in the image of God, and when you do things that you ought to do based on the character of God, yeah, that's how you ought to be. And when you move away from that, you're now outside of the realm of what God wants you to be. So instead of divine command theory, this is what he talked about in a particular Facebook post. He's a pretty smart guy. So I wanted to ask your thoughts about this, because about this.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. Philosophically, divine command theory is the view that things are right or wrong or good or bad just because God says so.
Yeah, yeah,
And the big problem for philosophers is, how could anybody just saying something is the case make it true? It can't. And so that's the point where I would agree with Shermer. The divine command theory can't be the right answer. I mean, the view
yeah,
your friend describes, I think that's the true view. I would just say, that's basically Aristotle's view. The difference is that I think you can take Aristotle and you need to Christianize him, which I guess Aquinas and plenty of others have done, but
Yeah.
you connect the tele, like the objectives, the purposes for which living organisms were made, to the creative intentions and design of a good creator, of God.
Right.
And
right.
that's where the function comes from.
Yeah.
And so that is, on the view that I think is correct, ethics does come from God, because God created this order where things are, certain things have value, and certain organisms are related to other valuable things in their very essence. And that generates an obligation, different kinds of obligation. And then part of that is the strange entity of human beings who, like other organisms, have a purpose built into us, but ours is so vast. It involves at least the whole earth and maybe the cosmos, and it involves our creator himself and each other. We're meant to be stewards of creation and to love each other, and to love and obey God as our king. So, but I think that is so I think Schirmer's right. The divine command theory is wrong, but he when he says that, I think what he usually means is morality has to be totally disconnected from God, and that's
that
not
makes
true.
No sense.
Couldn't be more further from the truth.
He calls it magic when you put God. I mean, he's an intelligent guy, but when he says it's magic when you use God as foundation for morality, I kind of lose the plot, because I don't see why he has to use the term, because God seems to me the best answer for why human beings are moral and why we ought to be moral.
I don't like recommending my own work, but there's a paper that I wrote a couple of years ago called Reality, A Shopper's Guide. And the last 2/3 of that paper, I make the argument you were just making. And I really like that argument. It basically it's an attempt to flesh out how God is the best explanation for not just morality, but so many of the distinctive characteristics of human beings that just cannot be accounted for on a naturalistic picture.
On a naturalistic perspective.
But on a theistic picture, I mean, even beyond Christianity, if you're a Muslim, if you're Jewish in a traditional sense, if you or if you're a Christian, if you have one of the kind of big three monotheistic views where God is a good creator and creates human beings like roughly in his image, it's a great explanation, actually. Far better than the naturalistic explanation for human beings.
And he called it divine moral rationalism. I butchered the term, but he called it divine moral rationalism, my friend, when he talked about this, that God is a moral archetype, and his essential nature defines morality. So that seems to me a better answer than divine command theory. And I guess it is. It defines why it is that we are moral, and why it is that we ought to live this way. But here's one more thing. The Euthyphro dilemma, which people throw at it when we talk about God being the source of morals, it's the Euthyphro dilemma that almost everyone would throw at Christians. Yeah. And the obvious answer would be, no, we're not talking about that. God's own nature is the grounds for his morality. His own essence is the grounds for morality. We're not talking about good as being outside of him, or that him saying something is good. Yeah, but what about the Euthyphro dilemma on the evolutionary ethicist? Because and I thought about that. I wonder, because why couldn't that be applied there as well? What is good is is what evolved moral senses think is good, or is good outside of one's evolved moral sense. And I wonder, can that be applied to the evolutionary ethicists?
Let me think for a second. I mean, my sense is I think some people have tried to give the answer, our moral sense evolved to the way that it did because it needs to give us access to what is good. I don't know what people have said about this. It's a good question. I mean, I think they could try to take either horn. They could try to tie knowledge of morality to some story on which that can give some adaptive advantage, which they can do because you can tell a story about how any feature confers an adaptive advantage. I mean, the trouble with evolutionary psychology is, and these kinds of explanations, is it's so easy to tell a story where in that story, this or that characteristic confers a survival advantage.
An advantage, yeah.
I mean,
reciprocal altruism.
Yeah, I mean, what the field needs to do, I think, if they were being intellectually honest, to say, let's spend a few years trying to show what examples of things that cannot be given an adaptive, justification. I don't think they'll be able to find any. And then I think they'll realize it's not a good way of proceeding. Because you can just, I mean, I don't know, you've seen these, like, human beings are social, and the reason we're social is because that confers a survival advantage. Oh, human beings are very violent, and they dominate other humans. Oh, but that's because it confers a survival advantage. I mean, anything
can confer a survival advantage. So at the end of the day, it's
or at least it seems that way. That's, I think, a huge hurdle they would have to get over to be taken more seriously. But running this kind of Euthyphro problem, I think you could do it, and it could be a way of sorting evolutionary psychological accounts of morality in different kinds, like ones that say what we think of as good and bad, we think of as good and bad just because that's how our moral sense evolved. And I think that's what most people would say. But then it's hard for them to take it as objectively true, which they're consistent. They tend to say, they tend to be these kinds of naturalistic moral nihilists. The harder one is to say it evolved to get things right. And this is the horn that Nagel pushes on in Mind and Cosmos, because Nagel was coming at it from the perspective that there really is objective morality. How could we have evolved to know about it? With random mutation and natural selection, this mechanism does not seem capable.
Yeah, so that's putting the good outside of the process.
Right.
So,
it would be unbelievable. It would be a miracle if we could know what was right and wrong. Yet we do. And so he takes that as an objection to naturalistic evolution. So I think you could set up a version of the Euthyphro dilemma for evolutionary moral psychology. I think it's easier. Was it easier? No, I think here's the kind of the rhetorical problem, I guess. With theists, just as a contingent historical fact, are usually objectivists about morality. And so both horns of the dilemma work against the theist. But evolutionary moral psychologists aren't as committed to objective morality. So it's easier for them to take one of the two horns and just say, oh, we just think certain things are good and bad and right or wrong because of how we evolved. It's not really tracking anything that's independent of us. They're more willing to embrace relativism or nihilism than most theists are. So you could use it, but rhetorically, it's not as strong, I think, for that reason.
Ultimately, I don't see any value in evolutionary ideas, accounts of morality, but the Euthyphro dilemma, applied there does make sense. Can any kind of normativity work in naturalism? Because Planting is said, is it the Achilles heel of naturalism? Is any sort of normative?
Well, I think naturalism is all Achilles heels. It has so many of them. It's like a centipede, and all the heels are injured. But rationality is one of them. I mean, I don't recall this argument from Plantinga, but there's a huge problem with how we can know about objective right and wrong or good and bad. But the first reaction that some naturalists will make is, well, there's something like normativity, just in terms of rationality, right? Like, I want to achieve this end. There are rational or irrational ways of going about that. Like if I want to come to Kerala, it makes sense to get on an airplane, and it doesn't make sense to like pack my backpack and walk out my front door and start walking toward the beach. And so there's a normativity built into rationality, but maybe, as Plantinga is saying, I don't recall. I mean, that's still, naturalism can't explain that normativity any better than they can moral normativity. And this is what some naturalists who I think are very honest, like I mentioned him earlier, Alex Rosenberg, have recognized, like, there's still a normativity to rationality. That still doesn't make sense on a naturalist picture. It fares no better than moral or ethical normativity.
Yeah, yeah.
Like a kind of instrumental rationality, that is.
Right, right. Yeah, because it does seem, it seems kind of flotsam and jetsam all over there, with the atheistic views of all of these ideas of rationality, of logic. Dr. James Anderson writes this wonderful paper on the loss of logic and divine thoughts, and then on to a theistic conception. So, and all of these factors these transcendentals don't seem to have any sort of founding if you don't consider a theistic framework. I guess that would be the same for the laws of mathematics, moral arguments, obviously. All of these seem to me to be outside of the realm of scientific explanations, and I guess you need a transcendent grounding for these to be there, for these to then to be able to use them in your scientific experimentation, not the other way around. At least it seems to me.
Maybe so. I'm not 100% convinced of this, but I haven't thought about it a ton. I mean, I think what a theistic view can offer here is the possibility of a certain kind of unified explanation. I mean, ultimately, the theist has to say, well, so you're giving an explanation, you're saying, why is this the way it is? Well, this is the way it is because of this, like, explanatorily prior thing. Well, why is that the way it is? Well, that's because of this other explanatorily prior thing. And you want there to be an end. You know, you don't want it just to keep going forever.
Yeah, the regress going on.
Yeah. And so theists say that the end of it is God. And so we're allowed to have a stopping place. So the atheists are allowed to have a stopping place too. So if the atheist says, why is the realm of mathematics objective in the way it is? It just is. They're allowed to say that. And that's, as far as I can tell, as good of an answer, a good of a stopping place. No, it's not bad just because it's a stopping place. The trouble, I think, is that stopping place won't work for everything. Like, they can't ground morality in mathematics. They can't ground mind in mathematics. They can't ground materiality in mathematics. And so the trouble is they're going to wind up with all of these different foundational starting points. But the theist, I think, potentially can unify them all on this one single ground, God. It's just less clear to me how mathematics is a part of that, just because I haven't thought of it as much. I think there are probably ways, but so much of what we explain about human beings very naturally comes back to God, because God is a personal being. And so it's very intuitive that many things about how we are would come from the being that made us to be like him. But I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off.
Oh no, it's just that I guess true propositions, you cannot ground any true proposition in a naturalistic framework, can you? At least that's part of the argument, because
I mean, maybe not, because the question would be, what if you're a naturalist, what is a proposition? Interestingly, my advisor wrote a book about propositions and what they are. It's a weird thing, but I think it's an interesting one. Some people say, well, they're thoughts, and some people say, no, they're these abstract entities like properties or universals that just exist out there. And so the trouble is that neither of those work very well for the naturalist. They can't explain the intentional thought, because that's too spooky. How do you explain that with naturalistic principles? Abstract, transcendent universals, or things like transcendent universals, to be propositions that then like mirror reality. Equally strange.
I guess that's the distinction between divine conceptualism and Platonism.
I think so, yeah. Or even human conceptualism. Any kind of conceptualism, naturalism doesn't seem to be able to explain.
Yeah, immateriality would be really hard to explain from an atheistic standpoint. So I guess any sort of these, or all of these, would be hard for them, because ultimately, when you, I guess, in a reductionistic perspective, you've got to reduce this down to material properties, and all of these kind of transcend that in some way. So
yes, I mean, maybe a kind of maybe oversimplified way of thinking about it is, for there to be a true proposition, one thing has to be about another thing. You have to have this one thing that gets reality right or doesn't. And if it gets it right, it's true. But what is this getting right? It's, how can one thing be about or reflect or represent another thing? It doesn't seem like something you can explain in terms of any known material forces or natural processes. A move that naturalists will sometimes make is they try to start importing transcendent stuff into their view, like, well, it's all, empirical processes and intentionality. They start smuggling things in because they have to. And in a way, that's the fair move. Like, you have to account for reality how it is. But then they have, once the doors open to that, on what grounds do you bring in intentionality? Well, it seems like it's really out in the world. Well, so does objective morality. I mean, so does rationality. So does now the floodgates are open and it's hard to. How are you still a naturalist? You're just you're edging. You're running down the slippery slope toward a true view of reality.
So you start off with the assumption of metaphysical naturalism, or is that philosophical naturalism? Or I guess they're both the same.
Same thing, yeah.
As opposed to methodological naturalism.
Oh yeah, people make this distinction.
I wanted to ask you about that because you mentioned philosophical naturalism in a conversation. Now I don't remember if it was the bioethics conversation or if it was with Shermer. I think it was in the bioethics thing that you and Dr. Davison Hunter, when you talked with a Harvard professor.
You've really done your research, Karen. I think you're the only person who's seen that interview.
I love the talk because you guys went into Kant and all of that, so I kept listening to it. And you mentioned philosophical naturalism, and I wanted to ask you about this as well. So I got the opportunity. So yeah. Is that distinction there?
The philosophical or the metaphysical, or what is? I guess the terminology is usually ontological naturalism and methodological naturalism. Yeah. I don't think about that distinction too much. And why is that? I guess I think why would you follow methodological naturalism if you're not an ontological naturalist? I mean, sometimes this comes up in discussions about the proper method of science, right? Some people will say, "Oh, I'm not an ontological naturalist, but I think science needs to remain methodologically naturalist." I guess why I don't think about it too much is, to me, science is definite. Science means many things, but the interesting conception of science for discussions like ours is one that I think is definitionally tied to empirical research. And so I think it is, the science in this sense is I think this is right. I think it is methodologically naturalist. I would just say, to have an accurate view of reality, you have to supplement this method with others that enable you to know about non-empirical things. And I guess at the end of the day, I don't care about whether science is remaining like ruthlessly methodologically naturalist. Like if someone said, I'm presupposing, and then they presuppose some religious claim about the nature of the universe, and they're trying to use empirical methods to play a role in this broader theory. I'm fine with that, because ultimately, I think you have to have a view that synthesizes all the aspects of reality. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. I think so often in these conversations, what we mean by science is already definitionally tied to naturalist methods. It just doesn't come up. And I'm willing to sort of grant, for the sake of these conversations, what I mean by science is naturalistic, and that's fine. You just have to supplement it with other ways of knowing, so that you don't wind up as an ontological naturalist, because that would be a false view of the world.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if that's interesting, but yeah.
Yeah. And assuming ontological naturalism, how would you do science? It's always intrigued me, because you have to assume uniformity in nature in some sense, right? To do science, you're assuming that the laws stay relevant, that they stay the same, and what are you basing that on if you're assuming metaphysical naturalism from the beginning, or ontological naturalism? it's just the way it is. That's again no, not an explanation. It's Hume's conundrum, right? It's Hume's question as to the uniformity in nature.
Yeah. I'm sorry, just thinking here for a second. It's a good
Oh
question.
yeah,
Right. Hmm. It seems, I mean, it is a classic, it's a classic conundrum of how to justify the laws of nature empirically, as Hume pointed out. And it's not, I'm not deeply well read in philosophy of science, but it's not clear to me that this problem has been solved.
right.
Does that mean you have to stop being a naturalist? I don't know. It's an interesting question. It's not clear to me that you do, but maybe a rigorous analysis of it would show that you wind up being forced to posit the existence of something that wouldn't be naturalistic. I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's it's an argument that a lot of presuppositional apologists might make, and it's an argument that I've seen in well, literature as well. And Dr. James Anderson in a lecture on the laws of nature and nature's God made the argument, and it's something that's always well. I like the argument, and I would keep on thinking about it. And yeah, your book on science and morality and all of that. Yeah, well, I thought I'd ask you about it too, because yeah, it's it's fun to think of, and
yeah,
yeah, so so
there
that's
are many questions. That's what I love about the world of inquiry. If you're curious, there are
yeah,
many things
yeah.
to know, and
Oh yeah,
and just as interestingly, there are many things that no one knows yet. I love that.
yeah,
It's
that's
fun to
true.
try to find out.
And on there's one more thing, because you talked about Jonathan Haidt's moral foundation theory. It's something else that he uses a lot of Indian context in that. Now, it's not really well. Excuse me. It's not exactly what's going on here. It takes place in Orissa, which is kind of which is in the northern part of India, and I think it's a bit dated. But yeah, it would be true in a rural sense. But uh, the more interesting fact is his idea of there being this universal moral taste like structure, right? So he mentions six factors, or was
That's
it?
right.
Yeah, he mentions six, and each culture would have their own mix of these views based on how they were raised, based on the societal factors, and all of those things, and I wondered about that and Noam Chomsky's view of linguistics,
Huh.
because he talks about babies having this sense of language already in them, all languages in them at birth, as opposed to a blank slate. And then their parents, when they talk to them in their native language, they grasp that particular thread of the huge language,
Yeah.
the universal grammar that they already have, and then they catch on to that. But while they are young, it's easy to teach them all the other languages. Now I know it's not a strict parallel, but but it made me wonder, because the connection seemed to me to be pretty fun to think of. But yeah, so is moral foundations theory a good descriptor of why we are moral, or is it just an idea of, well, this might be how we came to be moral, instead of why we ought to be a particular way?
I I don't think it's either of those things. I mean, I think it's a really interesting and helpful typology of the moral factors that human beings tend to be sensitive to. Um, it's I don't know. Yeah, it creates an interesting way of sorting through aspects of moral reality, um, and shows how some of them may be related to each other, and things that are sort of like spectra or binaries. And it seems like a empirically useful classification for thinking about different specific cultural moralities. Like, oh, this group focuses on 2 of the 6, and this group focuses on 4 of the 6, and ways to help us kind of classify and understand differences between moral systems.
Respect and honor would be huge here.
Okay.
Yeah, because
respect and honor would be huge where I grew up in the southeastern part of the U.S., less so kind of in urban centers.
Right.
And but I don't see that it really tells us anything about why morality is as it is. I mean, there we have to get into like, I mean, maybe Jonathan Haidt does this, I can't remember. Maybe he tries to say, here's how each of these 6, moral taste buds conferred an adaptive advantage. He may try that, I'm not sure. But the trouble with that is, like I said before, the trouble with all evolutionary explanations, it could be anything. Or it can work either way. So I don't know. I think he's made a genuine discovery that's very interesting, and it's such a recent discovery. The implications still aren't fully clear. We'll have to keep thinking about it.
It might help in conflict resolution, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. No, I think, what's interesting to me is, I don't think it was as a result of discovering this. He claims that it's made him more sympathetic with political conservatives in the U.S.
Yeah, I heard
because
that.
He's realized they're just kind of operating on different taste buds than the progressives are. And yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. There's still the deeper question of, well, who's right? And does a correct view of reality require all 6? Maybe so. So
that's the level 1, right? That's a level 1 you talked about, and it's not reaching level 1 at all. There's no way in which it can. There's no way in which it becomes an arbiter of anything. It's just.
Well, and he, in making the classification, this is interesting. He has to decide what phenomena count as properly moral to make to classify a system. And I don't remember what his methodology is here. He might just say, what do human beings call moral, and then see how elegantly those can be divided up into categories. That may be what he does. But just because somebody says something is moral doesn't mean that it is. But in terms of a descriptive level, it's still, I think his moral foundations theory is really interesting. It's a gigantic discovery, I think everyone working in the field needs to be interacting with, and will pay a lot of more careful thought.
A lot of evolutionary scientists seem to start with this idea of ethics and then work their way back to epistemology and maybe, but not a vague idea of metaphysics, because Jordan Peterson seems to work on that level as well. He seems to start with an ethical level, a practical level, and then he seems to work from that to an epistemological level, or maybe even a metaphysical level, although that's, I guess, vague for him.
Yeah. I haven't noticed that, but I haven't thought about it. You may be right. And you're saying, like, you're just kind of remarking on this, like, what this thing that seems to keep happening, starting with the ethical and then going back.
Yeah, a friend of mine and I were discussing, and he talked about this, and I got interested, and I checked out Dr. Peterson's arguments about evolution in his Oxford lecture, and meaning and telos. And it seemed to me to be the case that he seems to start with the idea of ethics on a practical level, how that works. And then he moves back from there to epistemology and maybe a rough idea of metaphysics, although that's not really true. While if you look at the ancients, maybe the Augustinian view and all of that, you start with a metaphysic and then you come back from that to ethics, right? So
maybe I'm just speculating here, but my guess would be that for Peterson and for plenty of others who walk that path, metaphysics has fallen into disrepute. In
you mentioned that.
It's one of those things, like religion, where we can't agree and it can't be settled by empirical methods, and it's come to be seen as impractical. But logically, it's the foundation for any view of reality. And so I wonder if when people start trying to provide explanations, they start moving toward metaphysics. Because ultimately, if you're asking like where everything came from and what explains what, when you get down to that bottom level, we're getting close to the bottom level, you're doing metaphysics. So I wonder if it's just, if you are curious and you're trying to trace the path of explanation back, you're heading toward metaphysics at that point.
Right, right.
But that's just a guess. That may not be a good explanation of why it keeps happening.
Right. Dr. Paul Nedelisky, I've had a lot of fun talking with you. It was really awesome.
I have too, Kieran.
talk to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. It's been great. Yeah, it's been wonderful.
Yeah.
Such an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Talk to you about a whole lot of stuff. So yeah, thank you. And I never really thought I'd get through all of this. And I had a lot of questions to you. I thought we might have to, do it in the typical half an hour, 1 hour thing. But you were so gracious that we went on for, I don't know, 2 hours, I guess. I mean, when we covered the range of, I have no idea what, but yeah, I really loved the discussion with your book and all of that. So it's been such an encouragement, and I really thank you, Dr. Paul Nedelisky, for coming onto the podcast, and I hope that it helps a lot of people. So, yeah.
Thank you, Kieran. It's been my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you, Doctor. If you like this video, hit the like button, and don't forget to share and subscribe. If you want to watch more of Dr. Paul Nedelisky's stuff, I've put in links to some of his interviews and the book as well, Science and the Good, which he co-authored with Dr. James Davison Hunter. It's an awesome book, and I've put the link to that as well. Check it out, and I'll see you again next time. Goodbye.